The old auditorium of Berkshire Music Academy stood silent and imposing as Thomas Chen pushed open the heavy wooden doors. Afternoon sunlight streamed through tall windows, casting long shadows across the polished floor and illuminating dust particles that danced in the air. Thomas swallowed hard, his mouth dry with nervousness. He was just 14, small for his age, with unruly black hair that refused to stay combed no matter how many times his mother had tried that. "Morning, you're late," a sharp voice called from somewhere near the front of the room. Thomas squinted into the dimness beyond the patch of sunlight. "I'm sorry, sir. The bus was delayed and then I got a bit lost finding the right building." A heavy sigh echoed through the space. "Of course you did." As Thomas's eyes adjusted to the lighting, he could make out 3 figures sitting in the front row. The man in the center leaned forward, his silver hair catching the light. This must be Director Hargrove, the man whose reputation loomed larger than life in the music world. Even Thomas's mother, who knew little about classical music, had recognized the name when it appeared on the invitation letter. "Come forward, boy. We don't have all day." The director's voice carried the weight of someone used to being obeyed without question. Thomas walked down the center aisle, all too aware of his worn sneakers squeaking against the floor with each step. The sound seemed to amplify in the perfect acoustics of the room. He clutched his backpack tighter, feeling underdressed in his clean but simple button-up shirt and khaki pants, the best clothes he owned. As he approached, he could see Director Hargrove more clearly now. The man sat with perfect posture, one leg crossed over the other, an expensive leather shoe dangling from his foot. His face was all sharp angles, from his prominent nose to his strong jawline. His eyes, pale blue and intense, followed Thomas's every move with undisguised skepticism. On either side of him sat his assistants, a younger man with thick glasses and a woman whose fingers tapped constantly on a tablet. "This is the Chen boy?" Director Hargrove asked, though it wasn't really a question. "Yes, sir," the woman confirmed, not looking up from her screen. "The one Professor Liu recommended." The director's expression made it clear what he thought about that recommendation. Thomas stood awkwardly at the foot of the stage, unsure if he should speak or wait to be addressed. "Well," Hargrove finally said, "are you going to stand there all day or are you going to play something?" "Yes, sir."
No, sir."
I'll play," Thomas stammered, then winced at how foolish he sounded. He climbed the steps to the stage where a magnificent grand piano waited in the center. It was nothing like the battered upright he practiced on at home. This instrument probably cost more than his family's entire apartment. "And what will you be playing for us today?" The director's tone suggested he was merely going through the motions of a foregone conclusion. "Chopin's Ballade No. 1 in G minor," Thomas answered, setting his backpack down beside the piano bench. This caught Hargrove's attention. He raised an eyebrow and exchanged glances with the assistant to his right. "That's quite an ambitious choice," he said. "Most students your age would select something simpler." Thomas bit his lip. "It's my favorite piece, sir. Is it now?" Hargrove's mouth quirked into what might have been a smile if it contained any warmth. "Liu must think very highly of your abilities." Thomas didn't know how to respond to that. The truth was, Professor Liu had only heard him play once, when he had been walking past Thomas's apartment building and heard music drifting through an open window. The professor had tracked down which apartment it was coming from and knocked on the door, surprising Thomas and his mother. Director Hargrove leaned back in his seat and folded his arms. "Let me be frank, young man. I have 37 auditions scheduled this week. 37 students from the finest music schools and private tutors across the country. I'm only hearing you as a personal favor to Liu, who apparently has taken leave of his senses." Thomas felt his cheeks grow hot. "The scholarship you're auditioning for," Hargrove continued, "is the most prestigious opportunity this academy offers. It covers not just tuition but boarding, materials, private instruction, and performance opportunities that open doors to international careers." He gestured broadly around the auditorium. "In the 30 years I've been director, I've awarded it to exactly 17 students. 17 out of thousands, and every single one of them came with years of formal training and competition wins." The man with the glasses leaned forward. "Perhaps we should just let him play, sir." Hargrove waved a dismissive hand. Yes. We've blocked 15 minutes for this. Let's not waste more time." Thomas moved to sit at the piano bench, but before he could, Hargrove called out again, Tell me, boy, how long have you been studying piano? About 3 years, sir. The director blinked. 3 years? And who is your instructor? Thomas hesitated. I don't have one, sir. Not a regular one. I mostly learn from videos online. A beat of silence followed this admission. Then Director Hargrove burst into laughter, a sharp, humorless sound that echoed through the auditorium. 3 years of self-teaching and YouTube videos, and he wants to play Chopin's ballad. He turned to his assistants. Do you hear this? Lou sends us a boy with no formal training to compete for our scholarship. The woman beside him shifted uncomfortably. Everyone deserves a chance, sir. A chance, yes. A miracle is what he needs. Hargrove stood suddenly, pointing dramatically at the floor before him. If he plays the piano, I'll kneel right here. He jeered, loud enough for his voice to bounce off the back wall. The assistant with glasses looked mortified. Sir, please. No, I'm serious, Hargrove continued, his voice dripping with sarcasm. If this boy can play Chopin at a level worthy of this institution, I will drop to my knees in reverence. Thomas stood frozen beside the piano, humiliation washing over him in hot waves. He'd been naive to think this audition was anything but a setup for failure. His mom had warned him, hadn't she? Said these fancy music people would never take someone like him seriously. But Professor Liu had been so encouraging, so certain that Thomas had something special. For a moment, Thomas considered grabbing his backpack and running from the auditorium. It would be easier than facing the mockery that would surely follow his performance. These people had already decided he wasn't good enough, but then he thought about his mother, who had picked up extra shifts at the hospital to buy him a decent shirt for this audition, who had pushed that old piano up 3 flights of stairs with the help of neighbors because she believed in him, even when she couldn't afford lessons. He took a deep breath and sat down at the piano. The bench was adjusted too high for him, so he took a moment to lower it. Aware of Hargrove's impatient sigh, the keys felt different under his fingers, more responsive, with a weight and resistance his old piano lacked. He placed his hands in position, closed his eyes, and tried to shut out everything except the music that had lived in his head for months now. His heart pounded so hard he could feel it in his fingertips. He knew the opening notes would reveal everything: his nervousness, his lack of training, the inadequacy of his weathered upright piano at home. The first few measures would tell these experts exactly what they expected to hear, that he didn't belong here. Thomas opened his eyes and looked out past the piano to the 3 figures watching him. Director Hargrove had returned to his seat, but was leaning forward with a smug expression, clearly anticipating disaster. The woman had finally set down her tablet and was watching with curiosity. The man with glasses offered Thomas a small, encouraging nod. With one last deep breath, Thomas placed his fingers on the keys and began to play. The opening G minor chord resonated through the auditorium, a single questioning phrase that hung in the air before he continued into the gentle, flowing melody that followed. His fingers trembled slightly on the keys, and he missed a note in the 4th measure, causing him to wince. He could almost feel Director Hargrove's satisfaction at catching this immediate mistake. Thomas pushed forward, trying to find that place he went when he played at home, that mental space where it was just him and the music, where nothing else mattered. But the weight of the moment kept intruding. The grand piano's perfect action made his every mistake more obvious than they would have been on his forgiving old upright. As he approached the end of the introduction and prepared for the main theme, Thomas made a decision. If this was going to be his only chance to play in a place like this, on an instrument like this, he wouldn't spend it being afraid. He would play the way the music made him feel, even if his technique wasn't perfect. He took a breath and dove into the main theme, his fingers finding their confidence as they danced across the keys. The melody soared through the auditorium, and for a moment, just a moment, Thomas forgot where he was and who was listening. He was just a boy playing a piece of music that had captured his heart the first time he heard it through a pair of second-hand earbuds, sitting on the fire escape outside his bedroom window, watching the city lights come alive as darkness fell. 3 years earlier, on a rainy Tuesday afternoon, Thomas had come home from school to find his mother and 2 neighbors struggling to push a battered upright piano up the narrow stairwell of their apartment building. He had dropped his backpack and rushed to help, wedging his small body behind the instrument to push with all his might. "Mom, what are you doing?" he had asked between heavy breaths as they paused on the second-floor landing. His mother's face was flushed with effort, wisps of hair sticking to her forehead. Mrs. Rodriguez from the community center called me. They're shutting down next month and selling everything off. This piano was just going to be thrown away because it needs some work. She smiled, though her arms trembled from exertion. I got it for $50. Thomas had stared at her in disbelief. But we don't play piano. Maybe it's time to learn. Something new, she had replied simply. It had taken them another 40 minutes to get the piano up to their third-floor apartment and wedge it against the living room wall. The dark wood was scratched in places, and when Thomas pressed a key experimentally, the note that rang out was slightly off-key. Still, there was something magical about having a real instrument in their home. That night, after his mother had gone to bed, Thomas had sat at the piano in the darkness, pressing keys one by one, listening to how they sounded together. Something about the patterns of sound fascinated him. He'd found himself returning to the piano each day after school, picking out simple tunes he remembered from music class. His mother had noticed his interest, but said nothing at first. Then one evening she'd placed a second-hand tablet on top of the piano. I can't afford lessons, she had said, but I found some free tutorials online. Maybe they'll help. Thomas had thrown his arms around her in a tight hug. It's perfect, Mom, thank you. For months after that, he'd spent every spare moment at the piano. He'd started with basic scales and simple songs, following along with YouTubers who offered free piano lessons. His fingers had been clumsy at first, hitting wrong notes and struggling to span even simple chords. But there was something about the challenge that pulled at him, made him want to try again and again until he got it right. The breakthrough had come 6 months later. Thomas had discovered a channel run by a retired concert pianist who explained music theory alongside the mechanics of playing. Suddenly, the patterns Thomas had been intuitively sensing began to make sense. He understood why certain notes belonged together, how chords built upon each other, why some progressions sounded satisfying and others left you hanging. He'd become obsessed, practicing before school and late into the night, sometimes with headphones plugged into the tablet so he wouldn't disturb the neighbors. His mother would often find him asleep at the piano bench, his head resting on his arms. You need proper sleep in a proper bed, she'd scold gently, guiding his half-asleep form to his bedroom. Just 5 more minutes, he'd mumble, but allow himself to be led away. The piano itself had presented challenges. Several keys stuck occasionally, and the middle D was perpetually out of tune no matter how many times Thomas tried to adjust it using online tutorials. But these imperfections had forced him to adapt, to find workarounds, to develop a touch that could coax the best possible sound from the struggling instrument. By the end of his first year of playing, Thomas had progressed to simple classical pieces. By 18 months, he was tackling Bach inventions and Mozart sonatas that the online instructors labeled as intermediate. And by the 2-year mark, he had fallen in love with Chopin. There was something about the Polish composer's music that spoke to Thomas in a way nothing else did. The emotional depth, the technical challenges, the way the music could shift from whispered intimacy to thundering passion in the span of a few measures. It captivated him completely. He'd discovered Ballade No. 1 in G minor during a late-night exploration of Chopin's works. The recording had started playing automatically after another piece ended, and Thomas had sat transfixed, tears welling in his eyes as the music washed over him. The next morning, he'd immediately searched for the sheet music only to find it marked as advanced and virtuosic. The piece was far beyond his technical abilities, but that hadn't stopped him. He'd broken it down section by section, measure by measure, sometimes spending an entire week on just a few bars of music. He'd slowed difficult passages to a crawl, gradually building up speed as his fingers learned the patterns. When the stretches were too wide for his small hands, he'd developed his own fingerings that allowed him to reach the notes. His mother had worried about his growing obsession. Maybe you should try something easier, she'd suggested one night, after he'd spent hours struggling with a particularly difficult passage, playing it over and over until his fingers cramped. I can do it, he'd insisted. I just need more time. And slowly, painfully, wonderfully, the piece had begun to take shape under his hands. The summer before the audition had been particularly challenging. Their building's air conditioning had broken down during a heat wave, and the piano had gone drastically out of tune in the humidity. Thomas had continued to practice, sweat dripping onto the keys, the discordant notes making him wince. His mother had picked up extra weekend shifts at the hospital to save money for piano tuning. When the tuner had finally come, he'd raised his eyebrows at the instrument's condition. "This piano needs more than tuning," he'd said. "Several hammers need replacing, the action needs regulating, and the soundboard has a crack. Can you just make it playable?" His mother had asked, her voice tight with worry about the cost. The tuner had done what he could, and while the piano still wasn't perfect, it sounded better than it had in months. Thomas had been so grateful he'd played a special mini-concert for his mother that evening, performing all her favorite pieces. It was during one of these evening practice sessions, with the windows open to catch any breeze in the late summer heat, that fate had intervened. Thomas had been deep into the ballade, lost in the music, when a sharp knock at their door had startled him into hitting a wrong note. His mother had opened the door to find a slender, elderly man standing in the hallway looking slightly embarrassed. "I'm sorry to disturb you," he'd said, "but I was walking past your building and heard the Chopin. I thought perhaps a recording was playing, but then I realized it was live." "May I ask who was playing?" Thomas had stood awkwardly behind his mother, suddenly self-conscious. "My son," she'd replied, a note of pride in her voice. The man's eyebrows had shot up. "Your son? How old is he?" "I'm 13, Thomas had answered, stepping forward. "Almost 14. The man had introduced himself as Professor Liu, a retired music teacher from the conservatory across town. He'd asked if he might come in and listen to Thomas play. Nervously, Thomas had returned to the piano and begun the ballad again, acutely aware of every flaw in his playing and in the instrument itself. When he'd finished, Professor Liu had sat in stunned silence for a long moment. "Young man," he'd finally said, "how long have you been studying piano?" Thomas had explained his self-taught journey, showing the professor his tablet full of tutorials and the online forums, where he asked questions about technique and interpretation. Professor Liu had shaken his head in amazement. "In 40 years of teaching, I've never encountered anything quite like this. Your technique is unconventional, yes, but your musicality..." He'd trailed off, seemingly at a loss for words. Before leaving that evening, the professor had asked for Thomas's mother's phone number. "There's a scholarship audition at Berkshire Music Academy next month," he'd explained. "I'd like to recommend Thomas for a slot." His mother had looked skeptical. "Those fancy music schools cost a fortune." "That's what scholarships are for," Professor Liu had replied with a smile. "And talent like his deserves to be nurtured properly." In the weeks that followed, Thomas had practiced harder than ever before. Professor Liu had visited twice more, offering suggestions and guidance. He'd been honest about the long odds Thomas faced. "Director Hargrove is notoriously demanding," he'd warned, "and the other applicants will have years of formal training. But there's something special in your playing, Thomas, something that can't be taught." The day before the audition, Thomas had practiced the ballade one final time on his weathered upright piano. His mother had listened from the doorway, her eyes bright with tears. "Whatever happens tomorrow," she'd said, "I'm already so proud of you." Thomas had nodded, unable to speak past the lump in his throat. He knew the chances of winning the scholarship were slim. He knew his playing wasn't technically perfect, but when he closed his eyes and let the music flow through him, nothing else seemed to matter. And now, sitting at the gleaming grand piano in Berkshire Music Academy's auditorium, with Director Hargrove's mocking challenge still hanging in the air, Thomas felt that same connection to the music beginning to take hold. His initial nervousness was fading as his fingers found their rhythm on the keys. The piano responded to his touch in ways his old upright never could, the notes ringing clear and true through the perfect acoustics of the auditorium. As the introduction gave way to the main theme, Thomas felt something shift inside him. The jeers, the doubts, the years of struggling alone with an inadequate instrument, all of it fell away as the music took over. And as he entered the heart of the piece, something extraordinary began to happen. As Thomas moved deeper into Chopin's ballad, his fingers found a confidence they had never known before. The magnificent grand piano responded to his touch with a sensitivity that his old upright could never match. Each note rang clear and true, filling the auditorium with sound that seemed to hang in the air like golden dust motes in the afternoon sunlight. The first minute passed, with Thomas still acutely aware of his audience, of Director Hargrove's critical gaze, of the assistant's curious attention, of all the ways his playing might be falling short of their standards. But as he reached the waltz-like section that had always been his favorite part, something began to change. The music took over. It was as though the notes on the page, which he had memorized months ago, were merely suggestions now. His fingers began to find new depths in the piece, bringing out inner voices and harmonies he had always sensed but never quite captured on his weathered piano at home. In the front row, Director Hargrove's expression shifted almost imperceptibly. The mocking smile faded, replaced by a slight furrowing of his brow. He leaned forward in his seat, his eyes fixed on Thomas's hands as they danced across the keys. The woman beside him had set down her tablet entirely now and sat with her lips slightly parted in surprise. The man with glasses was nodding almost unconsciously in time with the music, his eyes closed behind the thick lenses. Thomas noticed none of this. He had entered that rare mental space where nothing existed except the music, not the grand room, not the prestigious academy, not even his own doubts and fears. His body seemed to know what to do without his conscious direction, his hands finding the keys as naturally as breathing. When he reached the stormy middle section of the ballade, where the tempo quickens and the emotional intensity builds, Thomas's playing took on a new power. His small frame seemed to grow larger at the piano, his back straightening, his shoulders rising and falling with the surging dynamics. The delicate passages flowed like water between the thundering chords that shook the very air of the auditorium. Director Hargrove had completely abandoned his casual posture now. He sat rigid in his seat, his hands gripping the armrests, his face a mask of conflicting emotions, disbelief warring with dawning recognition of something extraordinary unfolding before him. The difficulty of the piece increased with every measure, building toward the technical challenges of the coda. This was the section that had taken Thomas the most time to master, the part where his small hands had struggled with the wide stretches and rapid chord progressions. For months he had practiced these passages slowly, patiently, building up speed bit by bit until his fingers could finally keep pace with the music in his head. Now, on this responsive instrument that seemed to anticipate his every intention, Thomas played with a freedom he had never experienced before. His hands stretched and contracted, his fingers flying across the keys with a precision that belied his lack of formal training. A few small technical errors crept in, a missed note here, a slightly blurred passage there, but these tiny imperfections were swept away in the emotional current of his performance. What Thomas couldn't see, lost as he was in the music, was how his playing was affecting those listening. The woman assistant had tears forming in her eyes, one hand pressed against her chest as though to contain some overwhelming feeling. The man with glasses had removed them entirely and was wiping at his eyes with a handkerchief, and Director Hargrove, the formidable, skeptical Director Hargrove, was breathing in short, sharp inhalations, his face flushed with emotion he was clearly struggling to control. As Thomas approached the final pages of the ballad, where Chopin brings back the opening theme before launching into the whirlwind coda, the afternoon sun shifted, sending a beam of light directly onto the piano. It illuminated Thomas in a golden glow, highlighting the complete transformation that had overtaken him. Gone was the nervous, awkward boy who had entered the auditorium. In his place sat a musician wholly consumed by his art, his face reflecting every emotional nuance of the music, the yearning, the passion, the moments of tender fragility, and the triumphant power. The coda arrived, that notorious final section that had given even seasoned pianists pause. Thomas's hands became a blur of motion, the notes pouring forth in cascades of sound. His left hand anchored the harmony while his right spun out the dizzying final passages building toward the thunderous conclusion. In the front row, Director Hargrove slowly rose to his feet, as though pulled upright by some invisible force. His assistants glanced at him in surprise, but his eyes never left the boy at the piano. His face had lost all its hardness, all its cynicism. For the first time in years, perhaps decades, he was hearing music as though it were new, as though the familiar notes of a piece he had heard countless times were speaking to him in a language he had forgotten existed. The final chords approached. Thomas gathered all the emotional intensity he had built throughout the piece and channeled it into those last crashing G minor harmonies. His small body seemed to contain a strength that defied his physical size as he delivered the conclusive blows to the keyboard, not with harshness but with a controlled power that sent the final notes resounding to the very rafters of the auditorium. And then silence. Thomas's hands hovered above the keys for a long moment as the last echoes faded away. His eyes remained closed, his breathing deep and slightly ragged. Slowly, as though waking from a dream, he lowered his hands to his lap and opened his eyes. The first thing he saw was Director Hargrove standing perfectly still in the center aisle, his face transformed. Gone was the contemptuous smirk, the dismissive arrogance. In its place was an expression of pure wonder, and something else, something that looked almost like grief. For several long seconds, no one moved. No one spoke. The only sound in the auditorium was the soft ticking of a wall clock and the distant hum of traffic outside. Then, with deliberate slowness, Director Hargrove took one step forward. And another. He moved toward the stage as if drawn by an invisible thread, his eyes never leaving Thomas's face. When he reached the foot of the stage, he stopped. His shoulders rose and fell with a deep breath. Then, to the astonishment of his assistants, and to Thomas's utter disbelief, Director Hargrove lowered himself to one knee. It wasn't a theatrical gesture. There was no mockery in it, no ironic fulfillment of his earlier jeering promise. It was instead a movement of profound respect, almost reverence, offered with a humility that seemed entirely foreign to the man's nature. "My God," he whispered, his voice barely audible. "Where did you learn to play like that?" Thomas stared down at the kneeling figure, unable to comprehend what was happening. I didn't, sir. Not really. I just played the way the music feels to me." The woman assistant had risen to her feet now, too, her tablet forgotten on her chair. "Director," she said hesitantly, "are you all right?" Hargrove didn't seem to hear her. He remained on one knee, looking up at Thomas with an intensity that was almost uncomfortable. "Do you have any idea," he said softly, "what you just did?" Thomas shook his head, a flush spreading across his cheeks. "I made some mistakes in the middle section, and the left hand was a bit sloppy in the coda." "No." Hargrove cut him off with a sharp gesture. "Technical perfection is the pursuit of students. What you did was something else entirely." He paused, seemingly searching for words. "You made me feel the music again." The man with glasses had approached now, standing a respectful distance from his kneeling superior. "I've never heard it played quite that way," he offered quietly. "It was as though you were composing it as you went, not merely reproducing notes on a page." Thomas's hands twisted nervously in his lap. This wasn't at all what he had expected. He had prepared himself for criticism, for rejection, perhaps for a few grudging compliments about his potential despite his lack of training. He had no idea how to respond to this reaction. "Thank you," he managed finally, his voice small in the large space. Director Hargrove rose to his feet with a slight wince, a reminder that he was no longer a young man. He climbed the steps to the stage and approached the piano, moving with a strange mix of hesitation and purpose. "Young man," he said, stopping, a few feet from Thomas, "I have been the director of this academy for 3 decades. I have heard some of the finest pianists in the world perform on this very stage. I have become..." He paused, a shadow crossing his face. "I have become jaded, perhaps, critical to the point of cruelty at times." He glanced back at his assistants, who were watching with undisguised amazement. They had clearly never seen this side of the formidable director before. "What I just heard," Hargrove continued, turning back to Thomas, "was something I had nearly forgotten existed. Not just skill, though your technique, unconventional as it is, shows remarkable development for someone without formal training, but something far rarer." His voice dropped almost to a whisper. "You played with soul, with truth." Thomas looked up at him, still confused by this dramatic shift. "Sir, I just play the way I feel it. I don't know if that's right or wrong." A smile touched Hargrove's lips, a genuine smile that softened his whole face, making him look years younger. That, my boy, is precisely what makes it right. The silence that followed Director Hargrove's words seemed to vibrate with unspoken possibilities. Thomas sat perfectly still on the piano bench, his fingers resting lightly on his knees, his mind struggling to process what was happening. Just 15 minutes ago, this intimidating man had mocked him openly. Now he was looking at Thomas with an expression that bordered on reverence. "May I?" Hargrove asked, gesturing toward the bench. Thomas nodded and slid to the side, making room. The director sat down beside him, his expensive suit brushing against Thomas's worn khakis. For a moment, he simply stared at the keys, not touching them. "I was a performer once," Hargrove said quietly, as though sharing a secret. "Before I became an administrator, before I started judging rather than doing, I played this very piece at Carnegie Hall when I was 23. He placed his hands on the keys, elegant, long-fingered hands that showed years of disciplined practice. But he didn't press down, didn't play a single note. Somewhere along the way, he continued, I lost something essential. The technical mastery remained, even improved. But the connection, he trailed off, then turned to look directly at Thomas. That raw, honest connection to the music itself. That's what I heard in your playing just now." From the front row, the woman assistant cleared her throat. "Director, perhaps we should discuss the scholarship." Hargrove nodded, seeming to remember himself. He rose from the bench and straightened his jacket, some of his usual composure returning. "Yes, of course." He turned to Thomas. "The young man, Thomas, is it?" "Yes, sir. Thomas Chen. Thomas, I need to confer with my colleagues briefly. Would you mind waiting in the lobby? Ms. Winters will come for you in a few minutes." Thomas nodded, still dazed by the turn of events. He closed the piano carefully, gathered his backpack, and made his way down the stage steps. As he walked up the center aisle toward the exit, he could hear the urgent whispers of the three adults beginning behind him. The lobby of the Berkshire Music Academy was as grand as the auditorium, with high ceilings and marble floors that magnified every footstep. Thomas sat on a wooden bench near the entrance, his backpack clutched to his chest like a shield. The late afternoon sun slanted through tall windows, casting long shadows across the floor and illuminating the framed photographs of famous alumni that lined the walls. Thomas studied these faces, wondering if he would ever belong in such distinguished company. There were concert pianists, renowned conductors, celebrated composers, all looking poised and confident, so different from how he felt right now. His thoughts drifted to his mother, who would be finishing her shift at the hospital soon. She had wanted to come with him today but couldn't get the time off work. She had hugged him extra tight this morning, whispered "just do your best" in his ear, and slipped $5 into his pocket for lunch. Money they could barely spare. What would she say when he told her about Director Hargrove kneeling? Would she even believe it? The sound of approaching footsteps pulled Thomas from his thoughts. The woman assistant, Ms. Winters, the director had called her, was walking toward him, her tablet once again in hand. "Thomas," she said, her voice gentler than it had been earlier. "They're ready for you now." He stood, his legs feeling oddly unsteady. What did they decide?" Ms. Winters gave him a small smile. "It's not my place to say, but I will tell you this. I've worked with Director Hargrove for 7 years, and I've never seen him react to a performance the way he did to yours." She led Thomas back to the auditorium, but instead of returning to the stage, she directed him to a small conference room off to the side. Director Hargrove and the man with glasses were already seated at a polished oak table, several folders spread out before them. "Ah, Thomas," Hargrove said, gesturing to an empty chair. "Please sit down." Thomas lowered himself onto the chair, his backpack still clutched in his arms. The director watched him for a moment, then leaned forward. "Before we discuss the scholarship, I'd like to understand something. Professor Liu mentioned in his recommendation that you've been playing for only 3 years. Is that correct?" Thomas nodded. 3 years and 2 months, sir. And you truly have had no formal instruction? No private teachers, no music school?" "No, sir. Just online tutorials and videos, and some piano forums where I could ask questions." The man with glasses exchanged a look with Hargrove. "Remarkable," he murmured. Hargrove tapped his fingers on the table thoughtfully. "Thomas, what you accomplished out there today was unusual. Your technique is unorthodox, certainly. There are flaws that any trained teacher would immediately identify and work to correct. Thomas's heart sank. Here it came, the but that would dash his hopes. However, Hargrove continued, there is something in your playing that cannot be taught. A natural musicality, an intuitive understanding of the emotional architecture of a piece. These are gifts that many technically perfect pianists would trade years of training to possess. He opened one of the folders and slid a document across the table. This is our standard scholarship offer. It includes full tuition for 4 years, plus a stipend for housing and materials. Thomas stared at the paper, unable to believe what he was hearing. You mean I got it? I got the scholarship? Not exactly, said Hargrove, raising a finger. What I'm proposing is something different. He exchanged another glance with his colleague, who nodded encouragingly. Thomas, after hearing you play, I don't believe our standard program would best serve your unique talents. You've developed your own approach, your own relationship with music. Conventional training might actually do more harm than good at this point. Thomas's confusion must have shown on his face, because Hargrove smiled slightly. Let me be clear. I am offering you the scholarship, but instead of placing you in regular classes, I'm proposing a specialized curriculum. You would work directly with me and a select few other faculty members who I believe can nurture your gift without standardizing it. The man with glasses leaned forward. What Director Hargrove is suggesting is quite unprecedented, he explained. Essentially, a personalized course of study designed specifically for you. Thomas looked from one man to the other, struggling to comprehend. But why would you do that for me? I'm nobody special. Hargrove's expression grew serious. That performance we just witnessed suggests otherwise. He paused, seeming to choose his next words carefully. Thomas, I've been in music education for over 30 years. I've seen thousands of talented young pianists. Many had flawless technique. Many had excellent musical understanding. A few had both. But what you have, that honest, direct channel to the emotional heart of the music, that is exceptionally rare. He leaned back in his chair. I knelt back there not just because I made a foolish, arrogant promise. I knelt because your playing commanded it. It was the only appropriate response to what I heard. Thomas felt his cheeks grow hot. I just play how the music feels to me. Exactly, said Hargrove softly. And that is the part most difficult to teach. Ms. Winters, who had been quietly taking notes on her tablet, spoke up. There are practical considerations, of course. Housing, for one. Our dormitories are typically for students 16 and older. Hargrove waved a dismissive hand. We'll make arrangements. Perhaps one of the faculty apartments could be converted. He looked at Thomas again. Would your mother be willing to relocate? We could find a position for her at the academy, or help her secure employment nearby. Thomas's mind whirled with the possibilities. His mother wouldn't have to work double shifts anymore. He would have access to proper pianos, to teachers, to music he'd only dreamed of studying, but it would mean leaving their small apartment, the only home he'd known since his father had left when he was 5. It would mean his mother giving up her job, her friends, everything familiar. I don't know, he stammered. I'd have to ask her. Of course, said Hargrove. This is not a decision to be made lightly or quickly. He slid a business card across the table. Have your mother call me directly to discuss the details. In the meantime, he rose and walked to a cabinet in the corner of the room. From it, he withdrew a slim binder which he placed in front of Thomas. This is the score for Chopin's second ballad. Take it home, study it. See if it speaks to you the way the first did. Thomas ran his fingers reverently over the cover. Brand new sheet music was a luxury his family could rarely afford. Most of his pieces came from free online sources, printed on their neighbor's aging printer when he had extra paper to spare. Thank you, he whispered. Hargrove nodded, then glanced at his watch. Now I believe we've kept you long enough. Do you have transportation home? The bus, Thomas replied, carefully placing the score in his backpack. Nonsense, said Hargrove. Ms. Winters will arrange for a car to take you. Thomas started to protest, but the director held up a hand. I insist. Consider it the beginning of your scholarship benefits. As Ms. Winters made the arrangements on her tablet, the man with glasses approached Thomas with an outstretched hand. I didn't properly introduce myself earlier. I'm Dr. Russell, head of the piano department. I look forward to working with you, Thomas. Thomas shook his hand, still feeling as though he might wake up at any moment to find this had all been an elaborate dream. Hargrove walked Thomas to the lobby, where a sleek black car was already waiting. Before Thomas stepped outside, the director placed a hand lightly on his shoulder. "One more thing," he said, his voice quiet enough that only Thomas could hear. "Thank you." Thomas looked up, puzzled. "For what, sir?" A sad smile touched Ed Hargrove's lips. "For reminding an old musician why he fell in love with music in the first place." As the car pulled away from the academy, Thomas gazed back at the imposing building, its windows glowing gold in the setting sun. Inside his backpack was a brand new score and a business card with Director Hargrove's private number. In his mind was the echo of a perfect performance and the image of a proud, stern man brought to his knees by the power of music, and in his heart was the growing certainty that his life had just changed forever. 5 years later, on a crisp autumn evening, the concert hall of the Berkshire Music Academy was filled to capacity. Every seat was taken, with people standing at the back and along the sides. A buzz of anticipation filled the air as the audience waited for the main event of the Academy's prestigious annual showcase. Behind the curtain, Thomas Chen stood in the wings adjusting the cuffs of his new suit. At 19, he had grown several inches taller, though he remained slight of build. His once unruly hair was now neatly trimmed, and his posture had the easy confidence of someone comfortable on stage. But his eyes still held the same quiet intensity they had 5 years ago, when he first walked into this building as a nervous 14-year-old with an impossible dream. "Nervous?" asked a familiar voice behind him. Thomas turned to see Director Hargrove approaching, his silver hair now almost completely white, but his step still firm and purposeful. "A little," Thomas admitted. "It's a big crowd. The biggest we've had in years," Hargrove agreed. "Word has spread about tonight's program." Thomas nodded. The showcase was featuring his own composition, a piano concerto he had spent the past 2 years writing, with guidance from the Academy's composition department. Tonight would be its world premiere, with Thomas as soloist and Hargrove himself conducting the Academy Orchestra. "I still can't believe we're actually doing this," Thomas said quietly. Hargrove smiled, a genuine, warm expression that had become increasingly common over the years. "Believe it? You've earned this moment many times over." The journey to this night had not been easy. Thomas's mother had indeed relocated, taking a position in the Academy's administrative office. They had moved into a modest apartment near the campus where Thomas had finally had access to a proper piano for daily practice. The transition had been challenging for both of them. New jobs, new home, new community. But they had faced it together, as they had faced everything since Thomas was a child. The specialized curriculum Hargrove had created proved to be exactly what Thomas needed. Rather than forcing him into traditional technical exercises that might have stifled his natural musicality, his teachers had built upon his intuitive approach. They had guided him in refining his technique without losing the emotional honesty that made his playing so extraordinary. There had been difficulties along the way. Some faculty members had resented the special treatment given to a scholarship student with unconventional training. Some students had been jealous of the attention Thomas received from the director. There had been moments of doubt, times when Thomas wondered if he truly belonged at the prestigious academy. But through it all, Hargrove had remained his steadfast champion. The director had seen something in Thomas's playing that first day, something he refused to let be diminished by conventional wisdom or traditional approaches. 3 minutes, called the stage manager. Breaking into Thomas's thoughts, Hargrove placed a hand on Thomas's shoulder. "Remember what we talked about. Don't think about the audience, the critics, the recording. Just find that place inside the music where nothing else matters." Thomas nodded, grateful for the reminder. Despite his growth as a musician, despite the technical skills he had developed over 5 years of intensive study, his greatest gift remained that ability to connect directly with the emotional heart of the music, to play not just with his hands, but with his entire being. "I should get in position," Hargrove said, giving Thomas's shoulder a final squeeze before moving toward the conductor's entrance. As the director walked away, Thomas called after him softly, "Thank you." Hargrove paused and looked back, one eyebrow raised questioningly. "For taking a chance on me," Thomas clarified. "For not giving up even when I wanted to." A smile touched the older man's lips. "I think we both know who took the real chance that day. A boy with an impossible dream and the courage to face down a room full of skeptics." He gave a small nod. See you out there." As Hargrove disappeared around the corner, Thomas took a deep breath and closed his eyes. He could hear the murmur of the audience beyond the curtain, could feel the weight of expectation pressing in from all sides. For a moment he was 14 again, standing in the wings of the auditorium, clutching his backpack and wondering if he had made a terrible mistake. Then he felt a light touch on his arm and opened his eyes to see his mother standing beside him, her face glowing with pride. "Ready?" she asked simply. Thomas nodded. "Ready." She straightened his tie with gentle hands, the same hands that had worked double shifts to support them, that had pushed an old piano up 3 flights of stairs because she believed in his dream. "Dad would be so proud," she said softly. Thomas swallowed hard against the sudden tightness in his throat. His father had passed away when he was very young, too young to have many memories of him. But one memory had always remained clear, his father singing to him at bedtime, filling their small apartment with music. "I wish he could be here," Thomas whispered. His mother placed her palm against his cheek. "He is, in a way. Every time you play," the stage manager approached again. "Places, please." "We're about to begin." Thomas's mother stepped back, blowing him a quick kiss as she moved toward the audience entrance. "Knock 'em dead, kiddo." The lights dimmed and Thomas heard the rustle of the audience settling into expectant silence. The curtain rose to reveal the Academy Orchestra already seated on stage, instruments gleaming under the lights. A spotlight followed Director Hargrove as he walked to the conductor's podium, acknowledging the applause with a dignified bow. Then Hargrove turned and extended his hand toward the wings where Thomas waited, and the moment had arrived. Thomas walked onto the stage, the spotlight finding him as the applause swelled. He moved to the magnificent concert grand piano positioned at center stage, the same model he had played during that life-changing audition, though not the same instrument. He adjusted the bench, took a moment to center himself, and nodded to Hargrove that he was ready. The director raised his baton, and the orchestra began the opening measures of Thomas's concerto. The piece started quietly, with a simple melody that echoed the folk songs his mother used to hum while cooking dinner in their old apartment. This theme would return throughout the composition, transformed each time, growing and changing just as Thomas himself had grown and changed over the past 5 years. When the piano entered, Thomas's fingers found the keys with the same certainty they always did when he was truly connected to the music. The technical challenges of the piece, challenges he had written deliberately to push his own abilities, faded into the background as the music took over. In the front row, his mother watched with shining eyes. Beside her sat Professor Liu, now fully retired but still a regular presence at Academy events. Around them were teachers, fellow students, music critics, and members of the public who had heard about the young pianist whose playing had once brought the formidable Director Hargrove to his knees. In the third movement of the concerto, Thomas had incorporated elements of Chopin's first ballade, transformed, reimagined but still recognizable to anyone who knew the piece well. It was his tribute to the music that had changed the course of his life, and to the composer whose work had spoken to him across centuries. As he played this passage, Thomas glanced briefly at Hargrove and saw the recognition in the director's eyes, saw the slight smile that acknowledged this musical reference to their shared history. The concerto built toward its climax. Piano and orchestra engaged in a dialogue that moved from conflict to harmony, and back again, reflecting Thomas's own journey from outsider to artist. The final movement brought all the themes together in a triumphant resolution that had the audience on the edge of their seats. When the last notes faded away, there was a moment of perfect silence, that magical pause between the end of a performance and the beginning of the audience's response. In that moment, Thomas looked out past the bright lights and saw Director Hargrove smiling at him with unabashed pride. Then the applause began, tentative at first, then building into a thunderous ovation as the audience rose to their feet. Thomas stood and bowed, gesturing to the orchestra and to Hargrove, acknowledging their part in bringing his music to life. As the applause continued, Hargrove stepped down from the podium and approached the piano. Without a word, he extended his hand to Thomas. When Thomas took it, the director pulled him into a brief, fierce embrace, a public acknowledgement of their journey together, teacher and student, mentor and protege. When they separated, Hargrove leaned close to Thomas's ear and whispered something that only Thomas could hear. Whatever the words were, they brought a smile to Thomas's face and tears to his eyes. Later that night, after the receptions and congratulations, after the critics had filed their glowing reviews and the audience had gone home still buzzing about the